The last thing my father said before I walked into that ballroom was that he hoped I wouldn't make the night about myself. I remember laughing quietly to myself in the parking lot because in 29 years, I had never once made anything about myself. Not my grades, not my scholarships, not the 11 years I spent becoming a surgeon. And I had no idea that in less than 2 hours, a stranger I saved on an operating table 3 years earlier would stand up in front of 200 guests and say my name into a microphone, and everything my family had spent a lifetime hiding would come apart in front of everyone we knew. Welcome back to the Family Revenge Tales. My name is Mara Calloway, and if you'd asked me when I was 12 years old what I wanted to be, I would have told you a doctor, without hesitating, without blinking. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood near Lake Norman, the kind of place with manicured lawns and neighbors who waved from their porches, and on the outside, we looked like a family that had everything figured out. My father, Richard, worked in commercial real estate and believed deeply and completely that a family's worth could be measured by how impressive it looked to other people. My mother, Elaine, believed in keeping the peace, which usually meant agreeing with whatever my father decided was true. And then there was my younger brother, Grant, 3 years behind me, and from the moment he was born, he was the reason our house existed. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it because it was simply the architecture of our family. Grant got the tutors when his grades slipped. Grant got enrolled in the private sports academy 2 towns over because my father believed it would build his character. Grant got a car for his 16th birthday, a good one, the kind you saw in commercials. When I turned 16, I got a bus pass and a part-time job at a pharmacy. And I want to be honest with you, I didn't resent it at first. I told myself that was just how things worked in some families. The son carries the name forward, the daughter finds her own way. It wasn't until I was 17, sitting across from my father at the kitchen table with my acceptance letter to a pre-med program in my hands, that I understood exactly where I stood. "Dad, I got in," I told him. "I need help with the tuition. Even with loans, I'm still short." He looked at the letter for a long moment, and then he set it down on the table like it was something he needed to distance himself from. "Mara, be realistic," he said. "Medical school is 8-9 years of your life. Who's going to want to marry a woman who's never home? You should be thinking about your future. A real future, not chasing something that's going to leave you alone at 40. I remember the sound the letter made when he slid it back across the table toward me. I remember thinking, this is the moment. This is the moment I stop asking this man for anything. "Find a husband," he said, not unkindly, almost like he was doing me a favor, not a degree. My mother didn't say a word. She refilled his coffee and asked if anyone wanted more chicken, but I caught her eyes for just a second before she turned toward the stove, and there was something in them I couldn't name yet, something that looked almost like shame. I didn't understand it then. I would understand it years later. So I stopped asking. I worked 2 jobs through undergrad, sometimes 3 during the summers. I took out loans that would follow me for the next 15 years. I remember one Christmas, my second year of medical school, when I couldn't afford the plane ticket home, so I stayed in my dorm and studied cardiac anatomy while my roommate video called her family from a warm kitchen somewhere in Ohio. I remember eating cereal for dinner 3 nights that week because groceries had to wait until my next paycheck, and telling myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need anyone's applause to know I was doing something worthwhile. Some nights that was true. Other nights I cried in the shower where no one could hear me, because being strong all the time is exhausting, even when you're the only one who knows how hard you're working. Meanwhile, at home, Grant was starting medical school too. Or at least that's what everyone believed. My father paid for it in full. Tuition, housing, a monthly allowance so Grant wouldn't have to work while he studied. Every holiday, every family dinner, every conversation eventually circled back to Grant. Grant's classes, Grant's rotations, Grant's bright future as a physician. I would sit there and listen to my father describe a life that, unbeknownst to any of us, wasn't actually happening the way he thought it was. I completed my residency in cardiothoracic surgery at a hospital that didn't care what my last name was or who my father knew. I worked 100-hour weeks. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. I stood over open chests at 3 in the morning and made decisions that determined whether a person walked out of that hospital or didn't. And when I finally finished, when I was offered a position at Duke University Hospital, one of the most respected cardiac programs in the country, I called my parents to tell them. My mother said, "That's nice, honey." My father asked if I had heard from Grant lately because apparently Grant had mentioned wanting to specialize in something, though nobody seemed entirely sure what. I want to tell you that it stopped hurting after a while. It didn't. It just became something I carried quietly, the way you carry an old injury that aches sometimes when the weather changes. I built a life at Duke that had nothing to do with my family's approval, because I had learned, the hard way, that waiting for it was like waiting for rain in a place that never got any. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday night that started like any other shift, a woman named Natalie Brooks was brought into our trauma unit after a highway accident that should have killed her. Her chest had taken the worst of it. I remember looking at the imaging and feeling that particular kind of focus take over, the kind where the rest of the world disappears, and there is only the problem in front of you and the steps required to fix it. We operated for almost 6 hours. It was close. It was the kind of case you think about for weeks afterward, wondering what would have happened if we'd been 30 seconds slower. She survived. A few days later, before she was discharged, I stopped by her room to check on her, and she was awake, pale but awake, and she reached out and took my hand before I could say anything. "They told me I almost didn't make it," she said. "You didn't almost make it. You did make it. That's what matters now." She started to cry, and I sat with her for a few minutes, because sometimes that's part of the job too, not just the surgery, but the moment after, when a person is trying to understand that they're still alive. "You were given another chance," I told her before I left. "Don't waste it worrying about the life you almost lost." I didn't think about that conversation again for a long time. I had no idea that woman would walk back into my life at the exact moment my family's carefully constructed story was about to collapse. The invitation to Grant's engagement party arrived in the mail on a Thursday. Cream cardstock, gold lettering, the kind of formal invitation that made it clear this was an event, not a gathering. My mother called 2 days before the party, her voice careful in a way I recognized immediately. "Your father just wants tonight to go smoothly," she said. "You know how he gets about attention being pulled in different directions." "You mean my career?" I said. There was a pause on the line, longer than it should have been. "Just let Grant have his night," she finally said, and something about the way she said it sounded almost like an apology she didn't know how to finish. I told her I understood, and I did. I'd understood my entire life. But I went anyway, because whatever else was true about my family, Grant was still my brother, and some part of me still hoped that showing up mattered. The party was held at a private club outside Charlotte, the kind of venue with chandeliers and a string quartet and servers moving through the crowd with trays of champagne. I wore a simple navy dress, nothing that would draw attention, because I had learned, over the years, exactly how to make myself smaller in rooms like this one. I found a spot near the edge of the room, close enough to be present, far enough to be forgettable. About 20 minutes into the evening, my father took the microphone. He talked about pride, about legacy, about watching his son become the man he always knew he'd be. And then he said the words I had heard, in some form, my entire life. "Grant is going to be our family's future doctor," he announced, raising his glass. "We couldn't be prouder." The room applauded. I clapped too, because that's what you do, even when the words land somewhere quiet and old inside your chest. My father's eyes swept across the crowd as he spoke, and for just a moment, they passed over me the way you'd pass over a stranger. He never mentioned that I was a physician. He never mentioned Duke, or cardiothoracic surgery, or the 11 years it took to get there. As far as that room was concerned, in that moment, I didn't have a career at all. I was still holding my glass, still standing near the edge of the crowd, when a woman in a pale green dress made her way toward me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It took me a second to recognize her without the hospital gown, without the monitors, without the fear in her eyes that I remembered that night 3 years ago. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is going to sound strange, but do you work at Duke, at the university hospital?" "I do," I said. Her hand went to her mouth. "You're the doctor who saved me. The car accident 3 years ago. I've been trying to find you for years to say thank you properly, and I never—" She stopped, looking around the room like she was trying to make sense of something. "Wait, how do you know Grant?" "He's my brother," I said. Natalie went very still. I watched something shift behind her eyes, the particular stillness of a person recalculating everything they thought they understood. "Your brother?" she repeated slowly. "Grant never told me his sister was a surgeon. He never told me much about you at all, actually. He mentioned you once, I think, in passing. I didn't even know your name until tonight." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and that silence turned out to be the first crack in something much larger. A few minutes later, I watched from across the room as Natalie found Grant near the bar and asked him something, her face still open and curious, the way people look when they're piecing together happy information. But Grant's expression didn't match hers. He looked like a man watching a door open onto a room he'd spent years keeping locked. I couldn't hear the whole exchange from where I stood, but I saw enough. Natalie asking a question, Grant's smile tightening at the edges, Natalie asking again, more carefully this time. I found out later that she'd started by asking which rotation he was on that month, an easy, natural question about a woman about to marry a doctor. Grant gave her a vague answer about being between assignments. She asked which hospital his residency program was affiliated with. He said something about the paperwork being complicated. She asked a third time, more directly, and that was when his answers stopped making sense entirely. "Grant?" I heard her say, her voice carrying just far enough for me to catch it. "What hospital? You've never actually told me the name of the hospital." I found out the rest of it in pieces later that night, the way you find out about a house fire after you've already smelt the smoke. Grant had left medical school 4 years earlier. Not failed out, not been asked to leave. He had simply stopped going, quietly, without telling anyone. And for reasons that still make my chest tighten when I think about them, he had never told our father. He had taken a job in pharmaceutical sales instead. Decent money, a company car, a title that sounded impressive enough at dinner parties. And every single day since, he had let our father believe he was still becoming a doctor. He'd learned the vocabulary, rotations, attendings, residency schedules. He'd built an entire fictional career out of borrowed language, and it had worked because nobody in our family had ever once asked him a real question about it. Nobody had ever asked him to prove anything. That was a privilege reserved for me. Natalie found me again about 20 minutes later, out on the terrace, where I'd stepped away to get some air and process what I'd just watched unfold. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "What people are starting to say?" "I don't know everything you've heard," I said carefully. "Mara," her voice cracked. "Please, you saved my life. I need you to be honest with me." I could have told her everything right there. Every year of favoritism, every dismissed accomplishment, every quiet injustice I'd swallowed at that family's table. Some part of me, the part that was still 17 years old holding an rejected acceptance letter, wanted to. But that wasn't why I was standing on that terrace, and it wasn't my truth to weaponize. I think you deserve the truth, I told her, but it's not mine to give you. It's Grant's. What you do with it, that has to be your decision, not mine. She nodded slowly, wiped her eyes, and walked back inside. I stayed out there a little longer, looking at the lights of the city in the distance, and I didn't know yet that Natalie Brooks was about to do something I never would have asked her to do and never could have stopped. When I came back inside, Natalie was standing near the small stage where the band had been playing, and she was asking one of the club's coordinators for the microphone. My mother caught my arm as I walked past, her fingers tight around my wrist. "What is she doing?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said. And that was the truth. The room quieted as Natalie stepped up, the microphone trembling slightly in her hand. She started by thanking everyone for coming, and then her voice steadied, and she began telling a story about a car accident 3 years earlier, about waking up in a hospital not knowing if she would survive the night, about a surgeon who worked for hours to save a stranger she'd never met. "I've spent 3 years wanting to properly thank the woman who saved my life," she said, "and tonight I found out she's in this room." She turned and looked directly at me. "Mara Calloway is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Duke University Hospital. She saved my life, and she is also Grant's sister." The silence that followed was the kind you could feel in your chest. I watched my father's face change, watched confusion give way to something closer to dread, because I don't think in that moment he understood yet what was about to happen. Natalie kept going. "I came here tonight excited to marry a man I believed was completing his medical residency," she said, her voice steady but quieter now. "Tonight, I learned, that isn't true. Grant left medical school 4 years ago. He's been working in pharmaceutical sales this whole time, and he let me and apparently his entire family believe something else." The murmurs started immediately, guests turning to each other, to my father, to Grant, who stood frozen near the bar with a glass in his hand he'd forgotten he was holding. My father's voice cut through the noise, sharp and defensive. "This is not the time or the place." "With respect, Mr. Calloway," said Natalie, "I think it's exactly the time and place, because while your son was building an entire fake career to impress you, your daughter was becoming an actual surgeon, and I don't think anyone in this room has heard you say that once tonight." I felt every eye in that ballroom turn toward me. For 29 years, I had made myself smaller in rooms like this. I didn't feel like being smaller anymore. "I didn't come here to compete with my brother," I said, my voice carrying further than I expected in that quiet room. "I stopped competing with him years ago because I realized competing meant I was still asking for something he never had to earn, my parents' attention. I worked 3 jobs to pay for a degree my father told me not to bother getting. I trained for 11 years without a single phone call asking how it was going. I'm not telling you this to embarrass anyone. I'm telling you because for the first time in my life, I'm standing in a room with my family and no one can pretend this isn't true." My mother was crying now, quietly, her hand pressed against her mouth. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, she found me by the coat check, and I remembered the way she looked at me all those years ago at the kitchen table, that flicker of shame she never explained. "I knew," she said now, finally. "I've known for years. I followed everything, Mara. Every award, every promotion, all of it. I was proud of you every single day. I just never had the courage to say it in front of him." I looked at my mother, this woman who had spent 30 years disappearing into my father's opinions, and I felt something in me soften and break at the same time. "You didn't have to fight him for me," I told her. "You just had to stand beside me." She didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. Natalie left the party that night without Grant. She returned the ring in front of everyone, not out of cruelty, but as she told him, quietly, mistakes could sometimes be forgiven, but a life built entirely on lies could not become a marriage. Grant didn't argue. I think somewhere underneath all of it, he was almost relieved the truth was finally out, even if it had come out in the worst possible way. The weeks that followed weren't neat. My family didn't transform into something new overnight, because that isn't how real families work, no matter what a satisfying story might promise you. Grant had to sit down with our father and admit everything. 4 years of lies laid bare in a conversation neither of them wanted to have. My father, for the first time I could remember, didn't defend himself and didn't defend Grant. He simply sat with the truth, which for a man like him was its own kind of reckoning. My mother asked if we could try family counseling. I told her I was willing to talk, but I wasn't willing to promise instant forgiveness, because forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't something you perform for an audience. It's something you build slowly, the same way you build anything worth having. About a month later, I got a text message from my father. It was short. He said he didn't know how to fix what had happened, that he'd spent so many years protecting Grant's image that he never stopped to ask what it had cost me. He asked if we could talk. I sat with that message for a long time before I responded. "Then listen first," I wrote back. I think about that engagement party sometimes, the way the whole truth of my family came apart in front of 200 strangers because of a woman I happened to save 3 years earlier, a woman who had no idea she was about to become the reason my family finally had to see me. But if I'm honest with you, that night wasn't really my victory. My victory happened years before that. Quietly, without anyone applauding. It happened every time I chose to keep going, even when no one at home believed I would. It happened in a dorm room on a Christmas morning I spent alone with a textbook instead of a family. It happened the first time I closed an incision on a patient who was alive because of my hands, and I realized I didn't need my father's permission to know that mattered. You don't need the people who underestimated you to approve of the person you became. Sometimes they never will, and that has to be okay, because your worth was never actually theirs to decide in the first place. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the child who worked twice as hard for half the recognition, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. These stories exist for people like you, people who understand what it means to build something real out of being overlooked. Every subscription helps us keep telling stories that remind people they were never as invisible as their families made them feel. And if there's one thing I hope you carry with you after hearing this, it's this. The best revenge was never about tearing someone else down. It's about building a life so honest, so meaningful, and so entirely your own that the people who once doubted you finally have no choice but to see you clearly. And when they do, you get to decide, calmly and on your own terms, whether they've earned a place in the life you built without them. What is the significant educational or other value in this story? This story speaks to the lasting emotional impact of favoritism within families and how children who are consistently overlooked often internalize the belief that their achievements don't matter unless someone else validates them. It illustrates the difference between love that is conditional on image and appearance and love that is genuinely earned through honesty and effort. The story also highlights the danger of building a life on lies, as seen through Grant's fabricated career, and how deception, even when well-intentioned or fear-driven, eventually collapses under its own weight and harms everyone connected to it. Mara's journey demonstrates healthy boundary setting, showing that forgiveness and reconciliation are not obligations owed automatically to family members simply because of blood relation, but processes that require honesty, accountability, and time. Finally, the story offers a quiet resilience that true self-worth is built independently of external recognition, and that the most meaningful form of success is often the kind achieved without applause, through persistence, integrity, and the refusal to give up on yourself, even when the people who should support you the most fail to do so.